the first pop-up lecture of the 2025 fall season of the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and our 23rd lecture in total. Thank you all for coming. My name is John Carlton. I'm the organizer of the Frankfort Heritage Week Coalition and the co-organizer of this lecture series. As always, I want to give a big thanks to Paul Sawyer Public Library for hosting us and to my co-organizer, Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney, for everything she and her staff do for these lectures and the community. And of course, thanks to the Frankfort Plant Board and Cable 10 for taping these lectures and for hosting them on their YouTube channel. And thanks to the State Journal for always giving us great additional publicity. We're excited for tonight's lecture for several reasons. First, it's our presenter's first lecture in the lecture series, and we're very glad to have her. Second, it's her second book on Frankfort history. And third, we are here to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the establishment of the once very small but very important settlement of Leestown, which occurred 250 years ago this month in July 1775, and predated the establishment of Frankfort by 11 years, and largely the settlement of Frankfort by nearly 15 to 20 years. Buffalo Trace Distillery, which now mostly occupies the former site of Leestown, takes its name from the old Buffalo and Wildlife Road called, I'm not gonna steal your thunder, the Alananta Wamioi, which like many similar roads was trodden down over thousands of years and used by indigenous peoples that occupied this land for thousands of years and later settlers and colonizers exploring the West. We weren't sure if we were going to be able to have an event to mark the 250th anniversary, but we're very glad we were all able to make this work. And I should note that Ms. Peavler's book was made in partnership with the Capital City Museum. There are copies in the back, and Ms. Peavler will be available after her presentation to sell and sign copies, so please stick around. So without further ado, please welcome Adult Services Manager Diane Dehoney to introduce tonight's speaker.
Good evening. On behalf of everyone here at the library, I just want to welcome you out. Thank you so much for coming out to support the Frankfort Heritage Lecture Series and Miss Patty tonight. It is my great honor to introduce our friend, Frankfort native, Patty Norris Peavler. She spent her early years, as she says, as a summer river rat on the family houseboat. She considers her daughters Penny and Maggie to be her finest accomplishments in life, and her granddaughters Scout and Izzy to be most delightful creatures. A product of the Franklin County Schools and Kentucky State University, her first career was as a local florist, with flower arranging still being a favorite endeavor. Joining Farmers Bank in 1983, Patty enjoyed 34 years there in the marketing department. Nowadays, she chairs the boards of the First Christian Church and the Housing Authority of Frankfort. She also works with the Capital City Museum, serves as an elder at First Christian Church, and loves reading books about Kentucky. Patty is the author of At the Bend of the River, A Story of Frankfort, Kentucky, and the book she'll be talking about tonight, Leestown, Where the Buffalo Crossed the River. Please help me to welcome to the podium, Patty Norris Peavler.
Well, first of all, lectures usually don't start with public service announcements, but I'm going to make one. As you know, the historic Frankfort Cemetery is very old, starting in 1845 with the burial of the Boones. I used to be on the board for a long, long time. The cemetery uses a card system. We don't have anything computerized as far as how where people are buried or how many of them are, all that. So Mary Ann Birch has started a campaign for us to be able to digitize these cemetery records. And I just want to thank her for that. You may have gotten a letter from her about that. If you did, dig generously. If you did not, dig anyway. But I do think that that is the first order of business to really help our cemetery be more user-friendly if we can get it to where it's easier to know who's buried there. And everybody and his dog are buried there. They really are. The next thing I want to do, which is not a public service announcement, it's actually just a real advertisement. My third book is called 25 Women I Admire. They are all Frankfort women, and one of them I'm so proud is here, Dorothy Wilson. And and you will be surprised at all the things that all of these women have done. Now, I just remembered that my glasses are in my purse, so just talk among yourselves. Okay. Since this is a pop-up lecture, we're going to have a pop quiz. My daddy worked for the F&C Railroad. Sorry, Phil Case. My daddy worked for the F&C Railroad. If I could show of hands, how many people know what the C in F&C Railroad stands for? Oh, good, lots of people. Who was the first person? I think you were the first person to raise your hand. Tell me. Cincinnati. It never went to Cincinnati, but you are not a goober if you know that.
I talk about it every weekend.
Okay. Well, okay. The reason why I mention the F&C is because the first time I knew a Buffalo Trace, I was 8 or 10 years old, and I was riding with my dad across Buffalo Trace in what they called a hand car. And it didn't have any sides, and it was really scary, but I loved it. And after we got through, he told me that the reason why there was a big U shape was because for tens of thousands of years, the buffalo, elk, and deer ran down that way to get to the river and to get across the river. So that is, thank you for being so smart. Let us see where I want to start after I tell you about my adventure with Buffalo Trace. The first European and perhaps the first African American were Christopher Gist and his servant, whose name we do not know. They appeared at the site of Leestown in 1751. And I was so excited to know that he had noted that he had been on the Kentucky River and about the sandbar, which was so good and all of that. So I bought his book. I think it cost $15, and he had 2 sentences. So, but that was okay. Christopher Gist is a really interesting guy. I'm sure it's quite true that he saved, actually, George Washington, not once, but twice. He and George were out and around, and they had to cross a really icy river. It may have been the Allegheny. And so they put together a little raft. Well, in the middle of the icy river, George fell off. And I think it was about to drown, so Christopher pecked him out. And so now we can thank him once again for the father of our country. However, there was another time when they were out running around, and they encountered some Native Americans, and George thought they were friendly, and he starts walking toward them. And Christopher knew that they had guns and things, so he pulled George out of the way. So we thank him twice for that. Gist and his servant roamed around southern Ohio, West Virginia, and central Kentucky. He was an employee of a company called the Ohio Company, and they wished to colonize this area, and they were, of course, going to try to buy as many millions of acres as they could from the different Native American tribes. Gist later became deputy Indian agent on Washington's recommendation, and he visited with the Cherokee nations often because the British really, really needed the Cherokees to join them against the French in the French and Indian War. And he died in 1759, I've heard, Virginia, Georgia, South Carolina, but he died of smallpox. But Christopher Gist is a really, I think, a fascinating creature. He has a son whose name is Nathaniel. And Nathaniel was quite the Revolutionary War soldier. And he, as a result of his service, he got 7,000 acres in Clark County. He built a home there called Canewood, and he and his wife Judith had 4 daughters. And let me tell you, everybody's daughters should marry as well as these girls. Eliza married Frances Preston Blair. She is the mother of Montgomery Blair, who was in Abraham Lincoln's cabinet, and Francis Preston Blair Jr., who was a Union general and a United States senator. Their next daughter, Sarah, married Jesse Bledsoe, who was also later a United States senator. Anne married Dr. Joseph Boswell. I don't know that he did anything except probably saved a lot of lives along the way. But Maria, their 4th daughter, married Benjamin Gratz, who is memorialized in Lexington with Gratz Park and was quite a prominent Lexington citizen. Now, in the early days, Nathaniel had been a trader with a band of Cherokee called the Overhill Cherokee. And it was there where he may or may not have been cozy with a young Native American woman, and she gave birth to Sequoyah, who is the inventor of the Cherokee alphabet. And it is said that Sequoyah came to Lexington to visit some of them, and that he used many times the name George Gist. So I don't know. Lots of different ideas about him. But I think that the next time I get up in Clark County, I'm going to look and see there is supposed to be a highway marker marking Canewood. So that's good. But anyway, okay. I now have another question for you fine people. Who has ever visited Divine's Corn Maze in Mercer County? Oh, tell me somebody has. Okay. Divine's Corn Maze in Mercer County is now on the property of James McAfee. And I want to talk about the McAfee brothers. Their parents were Irish immigrants. There was Robert, George, and James, and a number of girls. And they were surveyors, and they came to the site of Leestown and loved it, surveyed, had a good time, and then said, no, let's go on up the river. So they settled in Mercer County, and their little settlement is called McKee, after them. And when you go on 127, you will see there's just a little sign there that says McKee, and that's where they settled. They also decided that they had been very lucky not to get into any Indian trouble during their travels earlier. And so they decided that the Lord had been very good to them, and they started church, which is still there, and it's called New Providence. And David Rice was the first reverend there, and he is one of the very founders of Christianity in Kentucky. The brothers, I don't know why they didn't like Frankfort. In one of their journals, he said, oh, it was a lovely place and all of that, but then, they just went on up the river and liked it a little better. 2 of the McAfee brothers saw Revolutionary War action, and they also joined George Rogers Clark when he went on his sojourn to get Kaskaskia and Cahokia. So they are quite prominent Mercer Countyans. In fact, on my book, I talked to a woman who is the 6th great-granddaughter of Robert McAfee, and she still lives in Harrodsburg. So I think that's great. In 1779, the McAfees en masse decided that, they had this land in Mercer County, and the war was over and the Indian problems were less, and they decided now was the time for them to come. So they came to Kentucky, and they started out with, all the things that they needed. But one of the McAfee ladies was going to have a baby, like in a couple of days. And so they left her at home with her family. Well, her husband, I don't know why, he thought it was a good idea, but he started out with the party, but he was going to come back and get her. So he went out with them a couple of days, and I guess maybe he thought it was probably a good idea for him to go back and see how the wifey was. He found her riding her horse with the baby coming out to join him. So I always say that history is written by men, but it is women who make history. The next person that I want to talk about is a forebear of Richard Taylor's. And I learned through this journey on my book that there have been 8 Edmund Taylors. So like my family and lots of others, they use the names again and again. But the first Hancock Taylor that I want to talk about of note was an assistant surveyor of Fincastle County. He was Hancock Taylor, and his father was Zachary Taylor. You tell me if I get him wrong. His father was Zachary Taylor Sr., and his mother was Elizabeth Lee, and yes, the famous Lee family of Virginia. Hancock Taylor's prominent relatives included Mayflower passenger William Brewster, and of course, President Zachary Taylor, and through his mother, President James Madison. Hancock was quite the explorer. He and his brother Richard explored the Ohio and Mississippi rivers quite early, and they went all the way down to New Orleans. But in 1774, he and a surveying party were near the Kentucky River, and he was shot by Native Americans. And I'm not going to be apologetic. They were losing their land, and then they didn't like it. So he was shot, and at first, they decided that it was pretty dangerous for them to stay because there were just 6 or 7 of them. And so they decided that they would walk to Boonesboro. And at first, even though he was shot, Hancock Taylor could walk. And for several days he walked, and then he was so bad off that they had to carry him. And he is buried on land that is owned by Eastern Kentucky University. It is on Taylor's Fork of Silver Creek. And you can visit his, I think you have to hop some fences, but you can visit his grave. And there's also a roadside marker which commemorates that. I just want to say that he was an amazing man. Before he and his party had to quit because of his dying, he had surveyed 47,250 acres in central Kentucky, mostly around the area of Leestown and Frankfort. He did this because people who had served as veterans in the French and Indian War could get a land bounty and for their service. So people in Virginia were very eager to get these bounties, and he, of course, was very eager to help them out. When he died, his notebook, which was very important, was taken by his cousin, Willis Lee. I'll talk about him later. And it was carried back to Virginia, and they were able to recognize the surveys that he made. Now, I'm ready for a third question. I hope you all are. This is a 2-part question. Name 2 places in Scott County associated with buffalo. Very good, Richard Taylor. Very good. You are not an airhead if you know that. Second part of the question. County associated with buffaloes? Thank you. I didn't know if anybody would know that. Amazingly enough, you get, it's not a buffalo beef jerky, but it is a beef. Big jerky a lot of buffaloes. Are you the one? You're the one. Okay. Now, one of the guys that I'm really interested in that was a very early explorer in the Kentucky River area is a guy named James Norris, N-O-R-S-E. My name is Norris, N-O-R-R-I-S, and I tried real hard to make him kin to me. But my forebears were already in Maryland well before he came from England. So James and I are not kin. Another one that was really interesting to me is a guy named Nicholas Criswell. And he thought that he would come to America and make his fortune. But he was a loyalist, and when he found out that the Taylors were ardent revolutionists, they kind of had some words, but he ended up going back to England, and he did not settle here. But he gives his impression of a buffalo. Now, he's really impressed because he's an Englishman. He's never seen a buffalo. Now, I'm going to read about what he says. Who's ever touched a buffalo? Okay, good. They're pretty hairy, aren't they? They're very hairy. That's my daughter. See, she's a trooper. She can touch anything. Okay. Nicholas Criswell describes what he thought of the buffalo. Buffalo are sort of wild cattle, but they have a large hump on the top of their shoulders, all black, and their necks and shoulders are covered with long, shaggy hair. In large bunches of hair growing on their thighs, they have short horns bending forward, short noses, pending eyes, and a beard like a goat. In the summer, the hair behind their shoulders is short, as that of a horse. But in the winter, they are covered with long, curly hair like wool. Their tails are short, with a bunch of long hair at the end, at the end. When they run, they carry their tails up, erect. Some of them may weigh, when fat, he shouldn't have said that, as much as 1,400 or 1,500, I guess that's pounds, I'm not sure, and are good eating, particularly the hump, which I think makes the finest steaks in the world. Now here I'm going to say boo on all those guys that just kill the buffalo for their humps. They feed in large herds and are exceedingly fierce when wounded. Their sense of smell is exquisite. You can get leeward of them, maybe go up to them almost, or at least within shot. But if you are windward, they run long before they see you. They are fond of salt or brackish springs. Springs of this sort have large roads made to them, which we know, as large as some public roads. They eat large quantities of a sort of clayish, reddish clay found near these brackish springs. I have seen amazingly large holes cut by them in this sort of earth. Now, whether it is impregnated with the saline crystals, I cannot determine. They do not roar like any other cattle, but grunt like pigs. And so that he was impressed. One of the guys that came with Norris and Criswell is George Rogers Clark. And George Rogers Clark really intended to stay and make Leestown his home. And he wrote a letter. He wrote a lot of letters to his brother Jonathan. And there is a very good book by James Homhuber of the Filson Club, and it's about the letters between them. And anyway, he said that it was the finest place he'd ever been in the whole world, and that he thought that in a few months there would be 50 families living there. Unfortunately, 50 families never lived at Leestown. But he got busy, he got called away, he got a commission in the military, and he just didn't come back. But he did like it. Now, I had talked about the two Englishmen that I thought were so interesting, and the first one, James Norris, my almost kin, had a wife, poor girl, Sarah. She had 21 children. 16 of them lived, and in 1769 they sailed to Virginia, and they settled in Berkeley County, which is now West Virginia. But he was bored, and so he thought he would go on an adventure, and so he started out in the area of Pittsburgh, wasn't called that then, I think it was, and he came down with these other men, and they just explored around. He already had a nice plantation, so he wasn't really interested in getting land here. He just wanted the adventure of it. The other guy that I talked about is Nicholas Criswell, and he felt like that he could make his fortune in America. So he came over, but he only stayed from 1774 to 1777. He wrote a journal, which was not published until 1924, but he talked about his time at Leestown. In April of that year, Criswell and the other party launched two 30-foot walnut canoes. Now, I don't know a lot about trees, but that's a big tree. It was a dugout. They had two of them. They were called the Charming Sally and the Charming Polly, and they rode down the river with them. They also, amazingly enough, had servants. I don't know what they expected the guys to do, but anyway, they had servants, and they got to the site of Leestown, and they liked it very much because it was a big, wide, sandy beach and an ever-flowing spring there. And that is also what Hancock Taylor thought would endear people to the area. The party that the Charming Polly and the Charming Sally took with them included two of Hancock Taylor's brothers. Is that right, Richard? You said maybe uncles to me. Yeah, he was their uncle. And James Norris, as I talked about, and George Rogers Clark. Now, George Rogers Clark was considered to be the ideal man. He was tall, taller than most people, and had a very martial appearance. And Nicholas Criswell and James Norris were both very impressed with him, so I wanted to tell you that. When they arrived at the site of Leestown, they were really happy because they'd been paddling and they hadn't had a lot to eat, and so they caught some fish and killed some buffalo. And I'm just wondering, this is my third question, who in here has caught the biggest catfish in their life? Don't be shy. If you caught a 10-pounder, tell me. 8, 5, 5, okay, good. Now, sometimes fishermen tell whoppers. But that party caught a 40-pound catfish. That was a long They also shot a couple buffalo and had a really good time. And then they decided that they would go on up to see what was happening at Harrodsburg. And they went up by the river, and Norris decided he would go overland back to Virginia, and Criswell decided that he would go back by canoe. And so they're coming back down the river, and they meet Hancock and Willis Lee near the Elkhorn Creek. Now, the Charming Polly had had an accident. When they were making their beds for the evening, the two servants usually slept in the canoes, but the men slept on the land. But somehow somebody got messed up and all the bedding got taken to the land. So everybody spent the night at the site of Leestown on the beach. And in the middle of the night, a herd of buffalo came. Now, they jumped over one of the canoes, but they jumped into the other canoe. And pretty much, I think, tore the back of it out. So the guys had to really do some fixing. And of course, their flour was in there and their clothes and stuff, and they were really unhappy. But the next day, they ran into Hancock and Willis Lee. And Hancock and Willis Lee had some bread, which they shared, and they had some whiskey. First time I imagine whiskey was drunk on the banks of the Kentucky River. And Willis Lee had a 4-foot-long rattlesnake skin, which he gave to which Willis Lee gave to Criswell. And Criswell's family still has, I think the snake skin is gone, but it still has some of the things that he brought back from his sojourn in America. Now, things went well at Leestown for a little while, but they forgot one thing. They didn't have a stockade. They only had cabins. And when Willis Lee in April was killed, one source says hand-to-hand combat with the Mingo tribe. They came across the river because it was very low and they could just walk across. Now, the guns of the time were what's called big bore, and they caused a lot of bleeding. And so most of the time, people died from just bleeding to death. They couldn't stop it. If they didn't die from the bleeding, the wound got infected. So most of the time, if you got shot, that was the end. Well, the men that were at Leestown said, these guys are going to come back and they'll get us. So they decided that they would leave the unconscious Willis Lee with a bucket of water beside him. He was unconscious, so he wasn't going to drink it anyway. But anyway, it was a good thought. They left him there. He was about to die, and they knew it. And they started overland because they felt like that if the Native Americans came back, that they would be gone too. Now, Humphrey Marshall, one of the first historians of Kentucky, wrote perhaps the first history of Kentucky very early. He really liked the Lees, and here's what he said about them. He says, the Lees have a fair measure of education and culture. I don't know what tramping around in the woods has to do with culture, but they had it. They had a fair amount of culture mixed with an unusual social refinement. So Hancock and Willis Lee he wanted us to know that they were genteel and, of course, had all these important forebears. Now, after they left, I guess there were people coming and going by the river from Boonesboro and Harrodsburg pretty regularly, and two men came by several hours. I don't know how they know it was several hours, but anyway, the literature says that several hours later they came by and they found that Willis Lee was already dead. I don't know if they buried him or not, but I hope they did. Now, Hancock Lee, being the patriot that he was, served in the 13th Virginia Regiment in the Revolutionary War. And he And the people that were with him at Leestown were patriots, and they wanted to do their part, so they left. In 1778, Kentucky had 200 settlers, 200 in the whole place. And only 121 of them were able-bodied riflemen and women, I'm pretty sure. Leestown lay abandoned until Hancock Lee returned after his Civil War. Now, I want to say something about him because he never moved his family to Kentucky, but yet he managed to have 10 children. Busy guy. Hancock was just not going to take no for an answer that Leestown wasn't going to be the end-all be-all in Franklin County. And so he started to survey lots because he wanted people to come. And he promised that there would be a road from Lexington to Louisville that ran right through Leestown. Well, to tell you all today, that road is 421 and it runs from Frankfort to Lexington, but it is called Leestown Road. And there is a school in Lexington called Leestown School, and I'm sure the kids who go there go, I guess it's named after the road. Anyway, Leestown school is probably one, and the road are probably two of the more often mentioned areas. Now, there were two other Lee brothers. Major John Lee is one of the founders of Versailles, and Henry Lee settled near Midway. So they were a very prominent early family. I debated whether to tell you this story, but I'm going to tell it to you anyway. There was a family, the Andrew McDonald family, living at Leestown. They had twin sons who were about 12, 13 years old. And the mother of these boys told them and one of their servant boys to go out and round up the cows. They're out trying to find the cows, and the Native Americans capture one of the boys after killing the servant. The other brother is so distraught that his brother is going to be captured that he gives himself up. And they were taken north, and in Detroit, as luck would have it, there was a man there who knew their family, and he bought them, and he took them back to their uncle in Westmoreland County, Virginia. And they were 2 years getting home, but they both did get home. So, I mean, can you imagine the agony of the parents? You know, you don't know what happened, whatever. Let's talk about the 3 houses that are still standing at Leestown. Who's ever eaten at Limewater? Okay, that's one of them. The other one is the Beaches, now owned by Buffalo Trace. And the third one, I went to your birthday party at Limewater, so we've all been there, yeah. The third one is called Riverside, and I bet you've never heard of it or seen it. It is inside the campus, I guess you call it Distoria campus. It is inside of Buffalo Trace, and it has been much altered, but it was the home of Richard Taylor. Now, I'm going to talk about Richard, not this Richard Taylor, but another Richard Taylor. First of all, Glen Willis was built by Willis Atwell Lee, and he is the nephew of Hancock Lee. And he built Hancock Lee gave him some land along Kentucky River, right across from where the dam is today. And he first built a double log cabin, which he then built a brick house. And of course, the brick was made there, and it was very lovely. This was in 1815. And his family lived there even after he died. He died when he was pretty young. And the grandchildren of his family were fascinated because the dining room had wallpaper on it that had monkeys on it. And they had never seen a monkey and they didn't know what it was. So all the little neighborhood children would want to come and see the monkeys. But Glen Willis remains somewhat as it was in those days. The second one is the Beeches, built in 1818 by Harrison Blanton. It is called the Beeches because at that time, Blanton, it was a big farm, Blanton Acres, all of that. It was a big farm, and Harrison Blanton planted English beeches. I understand, a very beautiful tree. And over the years, the road encroached on the wall, the stone wall, and some of the beeches, and then the beeches got some kind of sort of blight. But the Blanton family was able to substitute American beeches, and so the trees that are in that yard are now American beeches, and I think they look pretty good. Harrison Blanton is credited as having a still early on, and he could have been the first person to have a distillery of sorts at the site of Buffalo Trace. I want to go back to Willis Atwell Lee. His sister, Sarah, was the first wife of John J. Crittenden. And of course, we all know he was governor of Kentucky, U.S. Attorney General, a lot of different things. I'm going to now talk about the owner of Riverside, who was Richard Taylor. And Richard Taylor had been very prominent in the Revolutionary War with the Virginia Navy. I didn't know that Virginia had a Navy, but evidently they did. And he was very prominent there. Richard had two sons, and he named them both after himself. Richard. Richard number one was called Hoppendick. And that was, he was the illegitimate son of Richard, but no one ever disparaged him about that. And Richard's mother acted as his mother, and so he was a very prominent person. But early on, he had sustained a wound when he was over in Woodford County, and his cousin had been shot by the Native Americans, and he was trying to get his body back because he didn't want them to mess it up, you know. So he was shot in the thigh, and he had a really interesting gait. So everybody called him Hoppendick, which I think is good. His younger half-brother was called Black Dick because he had a swarthy appearance. Now, Hoppendick served with William Henry Harrison when he was a general, and he said, if I wanted a man to storm the gates of hell, I'd send Dick Taylor. So there's the kind of man that he was. For many years, he was the owner of the Mansion House, which was the nice hotel where you would come and stay and have, in fact, Lafayette, they had the ball for when Lafayette came there at the Mansion House. Now, Black Dick came to Kentucky after the Revolution, and he and his wife had 15 children, but only 6 of them survived. Black Dick went to Columbia, Kentucky, in western Kentucky, and there he died in 1835 of cholera. But Hoppendick was a fixture in Frankfort for many years. Now, any boaters in here? I guess we all use nylon ropes now, but back in the day, we had hemp ropes. Franklin County was, and Kentucky actually, was a big producer of hemp. From 1840 to 1860, Kentucky was the nation's leading producer of hemp. Now, hemp was first grown in Kentucky in 1775. It is not native to Kentucky, and it is not particularly well grown in Kentucky, but they made it happen. There were a number of rope walks in Franklin County. In fact, Philip Swaggart and other very prominent men had rope walks. But the task, I'll call it, of breaking hemp was done usually by enslaved men because it was horrible, horrible work. The hemp factory was down where Jim's Seafood used to be until a few days ago. They employed about 100 people, men and women, and they used water to soften the fibers. And the biggest, last, best rope walk in Franklin County was called Kentucky River Mills. And it was founded in the late 1870s, in 1878. And the most important person that ever worked there was Paul Sawyer. He hated it. Paul's father, Dr. Nathaniel Sawyer, invested heavily. I guess he thought hemp was the next big thing. And so he invested heavily in it, and Paul, was just hanging around painting and going on the river and all that. So he decided that he really needed something good to do. Well, so he sent Paul as a traveling salesman for the bag. They made like a canvas, like a burlap bag kind of thing, and rope and twine, and mostly he wasn't very good as a salesman. And his father was just like, boy. But he finally said, I can't do this anymore. And that was when he went up the river to be at High Bridge, where he did some of his really beautiful paintings. Amazingly enough, the hemp factory did not close until 1951. Now, I was 1 year old then, so I don't remember it, but many Frankfort people worked there, and it was an interesting place because they got a lot of contracts from the U.S. Navy, and about 80% of the rope that the U.S. Navy used came from that hemp factory. And also, as late as World War II, there was a carrier called the Wasp, and they got a contract to provide oakum, and I didn't know what that was. I hope somebody knows what it is. It is a mixture of hemp and tar, and you stick it in the cracks and crevices when you're building the ship. And they got this big. They were very proud of it because, they were contributing very much to the war effort. Unfortunately, the Wasp was hit in the Pacific, and the Americans scuttled it rather than have it go to Japan for scrap. So all their hard work went down the drain. I know that everybody knows about Buffalo Trace Distillery. I guess they do. I know they do. But it is the culmination of lots of different distilleries. And I'm not really going to talk too much about the distilleries because we do know a lot about them, and we do, we're really proud of Buffalo Trace. My goodness, 400,000 people come there a year to see it. So, I think that's particularly really good. But I'm going to talk about a guy who had a distillery, but he really didn't like it very much, and so he switched careers. Now, there were two men in Frankfort at the time, about in the 1850s, the Swaggart brothers, Jacob and Philip. And I hoped my friend Dorothy Schweitzer Buchanan would be here tonight because she is one of their descendants, and I was going to have her stand up. Jacob Swaggart's son, Daniel Swaggart, purchased a warehouse at Leestown. There were a number of warehouses at Leestown because so much of the farm produce went down the river. And so there were places there to hold on to it until the ships boats could come. Well, Daniel Swigert in 1857 purchased this, I don't know how big it was, warehouse at Leestown, and he turned it into a distillery. Now, most of the time, distilleries were, copper pots made at home, put some tobacco juice in it to make it brown, that kind of thing. But his was more of a genteel. They were deciding that it needed to be a better product. So he turned it into a distillery, but after several years, he was like, this isn't for me. And he sold it. And he became the farm manager of Woodburn Farm, which was owned by Robert Atchison Alexander, who is, by the way, buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. Now, they had many wonderful racehorses, including Lexington, which they did not breed, but they owned. Daniel came to the farm right at the beginning of the Civil War, and the Confederates were really after the wonderful horses that they had at Woodburn Farm. So he and some of his farm guys would have to go and chase them down, and sometimes they got them back and sometimes they didn't. But from 1865 until the 1880s, Woodburn Farm dominated racing. Now, Woodburn Farm is still owned today by the descendants of Robert Atchison Alexander. Libby Jones, our former governor's wife. She owns that farm as well as several others. Anyway, Daniel decided that he would like to have his own farm. So his brother-in-law, Lucas Broadhead, became the manager of the farm. And Lucas and Daniel Swigert are considered fathers of modern racehorsing in Kentucky. Daniel bought a farm called Stockwood. And in 1877, he had a Kentucky Derby winner called Baden-Baden, and he had two Belmont winners. In 1881, he purchased a bigger farm called Preakness Farm, and that is the Preakness Stakes is named for that farm. But he didn't like the name, so he named it after his wife's grandmother, and here's her name: Blandina Elmendorf Broadhead. And his farm was named Elmendorf. He bred several Kentucky Moor Derby winners, Ben Ally and Apollo. And he is buried in the Frankfort Cemetery. Daniel's great-grandson was Leslie Combs II. He named his farm Spendthrift, after a famous horse that belonged to his great-grandfather. The horse was named Spendthrift because Daniel Swigert said that those were his wife's spending habits when they went to visit New York City. I'll mention E.H. Taylor, the father of modern distilling, and Albert Blanton, also one of the bourbon barons of great renown. But I want to say a few words about a man I knew from church. And if you go to First Christian Church, you knew him too. Elmer T. Lee. Elmer T. Lee was a soft-spoken member of our church. He always called me girl. How you doing, girl? And I loved him because he was just a lovely person. He was fond of driving hats. Now, he wasn't bald. I don't know why he liked a hat, but he wore a driving hat a lot. But he was also known for having a nose for good bourbon. He worked at the distillery from 1949 to 1985, and he grew from being after the war, he had gone to UK and gotten an engineering degree. And when he first went down to the distillery, Colonel Blanton said, "Son, we're not hiring anybody today." But a friend of his, Orville Shupp, said, this is a smart guy. You need to hire him. So within a few months, he had gotten on at the distillery, and he rose through the ranks. And I think that we will all agree that he is, although he probably got the idea from Colonel Blanton, he is credited with the popularity of single barrel bourbon. And now they have an Elmer T. Lee, pretty hard to get, I think. But he was a lovely, lovely man, and he is in the Bourbon Hall of Fame. And I want to end by saying that many people, early on particularly, would have said Leestown's a failure. 50 people never lived there. There were a couple of farms. They had one church. The church is a very interesting story, and maybe I'll tell you later. But today, 400,000 people, as I said earlier, visit Buffalo Trace. So I don't call that.
The number's actually 560,000.
Get out. That's wonderful. That's.
As of last year.
Well, I think that's absolutely wonderful. And so 560,000 people come to our sweet little town to see the bourbon. And I don't think in any stretch of the imagination that is a failure. And I'm going to give you the grand prize of the night. This is the Buffalo.
Would it make you interested to know that I work for Buffalo Trace? Thank you.
Well, you can buy those at the Capital City Museum.
I also work there. Purpose.
Of course, I want y'all to buy my book, and of course, I want to sign it. But I wonder if there are any questions about things that I've talked about. It's hotter than hell in here, by the way. Okay, Clay.
I have a question about the Buffalo Trace part of this.
Okay.
Not the distillery, but the Buffalo Trace. In
Yeah.
the description that was written about the buffalo, there was the mention of they seek out salt licks
Yes.
and brackish water. Was there a source of that in Franklin County in the Leestown area?
Yes, but the big ones were in Scott County at Stamping Ground. They would stamp, and the salt would come up. At least that's what I was told. And also, they would cross the river and go up the hill and go in Henry County to a really big place called Drennan's Lick, and that was became a very popular spa. I don't know whether people drank the salt water or what, but anyway, there were lots of small salt licks in Franklin County, but not of any huge amount like the one in Scott County. They were actually coming down, getting across the river so they could get up the hill and go to Drennan Lick. But that's a good question, thank you. Yes, sir.
When was the name Leestown first used?
Well, it was used by the first settlers, because I guess if you have started a little settlement, you're going to name it after yourself. Now, I did see a couple of times that when Colonel Taylor had Old Fire Copper and Carlisle distilleries, that they called it Taylortown. But I don't think that was used very much. It's almost always been Leestown. Okay, thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry.
No.
Quickly, when you were talking about the hen factory that was where Jim's Seafood was, you mentioned that area had several, and it sounded like roadblocks. Were you saying rope something?
Rope walks. I'm sorry, I was mush-mouthing. Rope walks. And I don't know how you make rope, but evidently you have, oh, my child is saying, get back. I don't know how you make rope, but evidently you have to, I think it's really almost like spinning yarn. You have to, do it around a lot. But anyway, they were called rope walks. Like I think part of the process was, you get on one end and you start walking to pull it some way. John?
Just to clarify, it was that the ropes they were making for the ships in the Navy could be so long that you had to walk it out to dry out. So these things were hundreds.
That's why. Okay, thank you. Because I wasn't sure about roping. Yeah. But I know we always had a boat on the river, and I'm going to tell you, my daddy had hemp ropes, and they were the scratchiest darn things you ever had to touch. So I'm sure the sailors weren't very happy. Any other questions? Thank you all for coming. And if you bought a book, I will sign it. I'm a horrible speller, so you might have to tell me your name.
Thank you, Patty.
Oh,
Really appreciate it.
you're
And
welcome.
I want to let you all know that we have flyers in the back. Our next lecture is August 9th at 1 o'clock Saturday. George Graham Vest, The Life and Times of Dog's
that's
Best
gonna be a
Friend,
good one.
by Steve Vest, who is the author and editor of Kentucky Monthly Magazine. So thank you all.
That's a good book. It's a good book.
Thank you, Patty.
Oh, no, thank you, John. I'm glad to
Appreciate
see you always.
Absolutely.